Hey folks, walk with me. I'm a little sweaty spaghetti today because it's unseasonably warm out for being late October. And I also biked a little ways to get to some different scenery today. So, double whammy. But, ghost story. So, I have, unless there's something I'm not remembering, which would seem a little odd and suspect, I have one ghost story. It was from when I was very young. But before I get into that, if any of you have ghost stories, I would love to hear, a little, well, make it as long as you want, a bit of it in the comments below. Or if you have even secondhand accounts, it'd be interesting to hear. To set the stage a little bit, the ghost story happened when I was probably around 4 or 5 years old. Or maybe a little older. I don't know exactly, but let's say 4 to 7. Later in life, like in my teen years and whatnot, I got very into Coast to Coast AM with the late great Art Bell, and he had just a tremendous amount of shows on everything from out-of-body experiences to, they used to do, actually it's close to Halloween. Oh, this wasn't even planned, but it's close to Halloween and I'm doing a ghost story. But they used to do for Halloween Ghost to Ghost on Coast to Coast AM. And so, it was always sort of like interesting to me to hear these things. But my story is this. So I grew up on a 200 acre family farm. It had been in my family, as far as I know, forever, meaning whomever came over from wherever, whenever, sometime in the 1800s, they established this farm, and that's where we still were. Now, for a period of time when I was young, my dad and I lived with his parents, my grandparents. And this was because my mother left us when I was about 1 year old. And so she wasn't in the picture. We didn't have a lot of money. And ultimately that meant we moved in with them. And it was it wasn't a small house, but it wasn't apportioned to maximize bedrooms. I guess you could say it that way. The upstairs was one of those very old, like the ceilings sloped inside the house to reflect the slope outside of the house. And so it was sort of like, very crouchy. As a kid, you didn't notice, but as an adult, you certainly did. And there were only 3 bedrooms upstairs. And so my grandparents slept in different rooms. And so that's 2 of the rooms right there. And then, so 3rd bedroom for my dad. And then I would often sleep with my grandmother. And that's where, I say this all to say that's where this story took place. So very old house, sort of a, just an old house, old farm sort of setup already. So I'm, like I said, I don't know, it's a little bit sketchy in my brain, 4 to 7 years old, something like that. I want to say I was on the younger side, but then I question whether I would remember the story. And I've always remembered this story, so I just don't know. But in any case, I woke up in the middle of the night and looked to the foot of the bed. And I don't remember anything in particular waking me up. It was just as though it was just a normal middle of the night wake up, but it was definitely like middle of the night. Of course, being that age, I don't know what time it was. I don't know if it was the dreaded 3 a.m. witching hour or whatever, but it was sort of, something like that would make sense to me. Look to the foot of the bed, and I see 2 figures. A very tall one and a noticeably shorter one. And I don't really recognize either of them, like at the moment. But what I do remember is there was something that made it look and feel like these weren't intruders, you know. It sounds tremendously unnerving to say, I looked to the foot of the bed and I saw two grown figures that I didn't recognize, right? That sounds like two people broke into your house and now they're standing at the foot of your bed. I remember immediately having the feeling that they weren't, you know, sort of like flesh and blood people, although I couldn't see through them. You know, it wasn't like that sort of transparentish, translucent quality that you sort of see in TV and film. So they were relatively solid. I do recall, though I question if this was sort of infused later on, that there was sort of a mild glow. But I guess that would make sense, because if it was the dead of the night, then it would have been incredibly dark. There weren't street lights, obviously, and there weren't night lights that we had inside or anything like that. So if I were to be able to see anything as well as I recollect it, they would have had to, in some way, have been emitting a bit of their own luster, if you will. And so tall figure, shorter figure. Now remember, I'm in the bed with my grandmother. And so I do what you would do. And it wasn't in a panicked way, because again, I didn't feel danger. I didn't feel that these were intruders or anything to be feared. And so what I did was I sort of like prodded my grandmother. And as a dad who has now slept with or shared a bed with, you know, his small children, I understand this. My kids all of the time will kick me, elbow me, slam their head into my head, and they just don't realize it. They're just sort of rolling around and moving in their sleep, but they don't realize what they're doing. So I would imagine to her, this sort of felt like that. And so I sort of, you know, give her a little nudge, and I'm like, look. And she, I don't think she even opened her eyes. I'm very confident she didn't. And she just sort of goes, oh yeah, interesting. I don't know if she's that interesting. Oh yeah, you know, that sort of thing. And just kind of like rolled over and was like, don't wake me, kid. And that was basically that. And so I sort of like looked back to these two figures. They didn't say anything. They didn't transmit anything telepathically. They didn't like make any gestures or motions, nothing that seemed like an active attempt to communicate anything. They were just sort of there. And I felt that they were non-threatening. And even more than that, I felt some sense of like, I'm trying to not say benevolence, but I'll just use that for lack of a better term. And so feeling like, you know, I had tried to alert my grandmother. She wasn't interested. And I didn't feel threatened, though the situation was odd. I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. And, you know, it's unfortunate. I don't recall if I ever brought it up to her. It would seem really weird not to, right? I mean, especially I think of my kids, and like, if they had something like this happen that they remember decades and decades later, it would seem odd to me that in the morning they wouldn't be like, can you believe what we saw last night? Or I tried to wake you up because I saw da 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 da. But I don't recall after that. My grandmother was a very religious Catholic, or at least she was a very practicing Catholic, I guess I could say. But I don't know what her response would have been to something like, very young Dan is claiming to have seen a ghost, or 2 ghosts, I guess, the night before. But yeah, they didn't resemble anyone. They weren't anyone who I could sort of, put a name to. And it was interesting that to me, but remember, this is as a very young kid, so you never know. But to me, they felt as though they were adults. But the one was, well, I guess I could say the one felt tall, and the shorter one came up to like maybe just below the chest of the other one. So like noticeably shorter. So what that means, I don't know. It's hard to know the sort of reference points of a child at that age, trying to decipher whether someone's an adult or a tween or whatever, or another tall kid. But yeah, so that's what happened, and it was sort of a one and done, and but it's stuck with me forever. I've not told this story a lot, but I've thought of it and have recalled it for as long as I can remember. This isn't sort of a newly remembered thing, if you will. Well, there you go. I happened to line this up close to Halloween, and it wasn't even on purpose. So every once in a while, something happens. All right, folks. Well, if you walked with me, we will have gotten 12 minutes in, so probably a bit over a half mile by the time all is said and done here. If you didn't walk with me, no worries. I certainly appreciate you watching all the way until the end. Drop those stories below if you have them. I'd be interested in reading them in the spirit of the great Art Bell. All right, folks. As always, I will see you in the next video.